Hi everyone, just welcome to the Circular Economy webinars from ERASME, which is a Germany Centers of Excellence in Sustainability. We are very happy to welcome to Calvin Jones about Cardiff Business School. Please enjoy to be there. I just want to remind you a few rules. Calvin, you have 45 minutes for a talk. You can stop when you want and we can have discussion with people. Everyone just turn off your microphone. If you want to ask a question, you can use the converter, the chat. At the end, we can open the microphone, but a very small time and for discussion. Okay, so enjoy the webinar and just let the word to Ed.
All right, so hello everyone to this new circular economy webinar. It's really my pleasure to introduce today Professor Calvin Jones. He holds a PhD in economics of tourism and major events. He has been involved in the development of a number of measurement tools for sustainability, including the pilot environmental satellite accounts for Wales and the tourism environmental satellite account for Wales. His research interests focus on sustainable regional development, energy economics and artificial intelligence, automation and future skills. Calvin is currently Deputy Dean at Cardiff Business School. He is a winner of both the Mouse Madden Medal in Regional Science and the People's Choice Award at the 1996 International Snow Sculpting Championship. That's really impressive, Calvin. Today, Calvin will hold a talk entitled Towards a Truly Sustainable Region, the Wellbeing of the Future Generations Act in Wales. Last time we had a Zoom bombing, so I hope this will not be the case today. But that being said, Calvin, thank you so much for taking the time and joining us today, and the floor is yours.
Okay, I'm saying screen share has failed to start. Why is that happening? Excuse me a second, guys.
Yeah, no problem. Do you have the, Arno, does Calvin have, all right, good.
Yeah. Just my Mac playing up. It doesn't like me very much. So thanks very much, guys, for the invite to speak to you today. A couple of apologies before we start. I have been known to speak fairly quickly, so I'll try and keep that in check for non-first language English people and for Mike, who's Scottish. And the material might be a little familiar to one or two of you. I can see who come from Wales. So apologies I go over what is a little bit of old ground, but I'll have to set the scene for our continental colleagues. In terms of what we're looking at here, I'm looking to report on the progress of a small region of the UK towards something that people in this meeting might view as what I call truly sustainable in the title. So something which goes beyond, kind of warm words and individual fragmented policies that might address a particular element of climate impact or a particular element of social sustainability, and to something which looks like a region which is really fit to face significant future pressures and which is reducing its own impact on the world. So what chance is there of a region undertaking that journey in Western Europe at the current time? And Wales is particularly interesting because it has embodied in law something called the Future Generations Act, which I'll come to in a second, which requires the public sector at least to behave in ways which are far more future-oriented than you would typically find, certainly in the UK, and I suspect in most parts of Europe. I'll talk about that act a little bit. So this isn't a circular economy presentation per se, I think it'll be of interest more generally to the audience. A little bit of background. So Wales, the area I'm talking about, is we used to be a nuts one region of the European Union. Unfortunately, no longer a nuts one region of the European Union. You get the sense I'm talking about. It's one level below the nation of the state, the member state level. Population about 3 million or so people, a little more. And in 1999, along with Scotland and Northern Ireland, it gained a measure of self-government from Westminster, Whitehall, from the UK government, which effectively covered public services such as health, education, planning, economic development, and a few other bits and pieces, although the UK retained control of the major economic levers, such as employment law, interest rate policy, and so macro policy. So that there's a limited room for movement, but certainly in the areas where we'd expect and hope to see some change in terms of climate and environmental responsibility, there's lots of tools available at regional level, at Wales level, although energy policy has been very minimally devolved, increasingly devolved over time. But energy is one area which I'll come to in a second to talk about. Wales is post-industrial and rural, so the broad brush, roughly half and half. South Wales valleys are former coal fields and suffer from continuing economic deprivation and resultant social problems. And I'm doing work on this at the moment. It appears that we still retain some communitarian behaviours beyond those of the rest of the UK, or certainly England, leaving Scotland to one side. So, for example, the dominant political party is the left of centre Labour Party in Wales, as opposed to the centre right and extreme right, arguably, which has held sway in the UK over much of the last 40 years. And you see with that centre-left orientation, behaviours around the environment, around social safety nets and so on, around the pushing back against privatisation agenda, for example, in health services, which are different to the rest of the UK. So you would argue it's perhaps a more fertile ground for sustainability than the UK as a whole, or for England as a unit, certainly. Wales has a long history as a resource periphery. So, I'm currently reading Hilary Mantel's book on the Tudors, Henry VIII of England and Wales. And even back then, which is 1530, 1540, Wales was known for its wool, its sheep's wool. And historically, the land has been what Wales has sold to the rest of the world, whether that's via sheep, increasingly via renewables. For example, our wind is increasingly important, our wave hopefully will become important. And there's that connection with the land and with resources, which has shaped our post-industrial landscape, but again, arguably gives you a more fertile ground for discussions around sustainability than in some other places, possibly. But obviously with a lack of political capital and other capitals, I'll come to it a little bit later. So the Future Generations Act is the result of a splitting of policy in these areas between the UK, stroke England, and Wales and Scotland post-1999. And from 2000 onward, and particularly in the 2010s, and after a further referendum on devolution in 2011, we saw greater devolution and greater what the Welsh Labour government used to call clear red water between London and Cardiff in how they managed the economy and public services. So the reaction to austerity was different in the 2010s. I say we have less, although some privatisation in our health service and more, and certainly in schooling. You see some privatisation of schooling in England through academies and free schools. You don't get that in Wales. And certainly in environmental matters, Wales has forged somewhat ahead of England, certainly in aspiration, if not necessarily in terms of results. So, for example, we had a plastic bag tax before England, not before England, before Scotland, I believe. And we have eco-footprint measures, which have been in place for a long time in Wales. And we have the launch or the development after 2007 and through 2010-11, through to 2015-16 of the Future Generations Act, which at the time and remains a very novel way of trying to move public services and public decision-making towards a more sustainable footing, and one which is more holistic, which accepts the importance of social as well as efficiency outcomes, and one which explicitly recognises the changing environmental, ecological, climate and social circumstances we find ourselves in. So it seeks to make Wales fit for the future in a number of ways by forcing, through the force of law, public agencies, 44 public agencies, to encapsulate future generations and their well-being in decision-making processes. And the Future Generations Commissioner was appointed in 2016 after the Act was passed in our Parliament in Cardiff in 2015. And the Act is powerful, potentially at least. It's it's very clear on its objectives. So we have, I mean, some of you have seen, may have seen the donut economics model by Kate Raworth, who's also a valued colleague of ours. And we've talked to Kate about the ways in which the Future Generations Act in some ways is conceptually similar to donut economics or to the SDGs. So we have this idea that you can measure outcomes and then change behaviors in a kind of DSIPR kind of system to iteratively improve your behaviors. It's something which I think is shared by those sort of metric-based approaches to understanding sustainable development. And the good thing about these 7 goal areas, which I hope you can read, you can't read in the screen because I haven't put forward the thing here, apologies. The good thing about these 7 goal areas is they were explicitly crowdsourced in a national conversation that happened through 2013-14. So these elements, so for example, we've got in there a Wales of cohesive communities, which reflects the communitarian nature of Wales to some degree, a Wales of vibrant culture and thriving Welsh language. So the Welsh language, spoken by a minority, but a large minority of the population, is very important culturally, and that's held to be an incredibly important part of a genuinely holistic, sustainable development approach to how we manage our region. Interestingly there, what you also have is, as well as these 7 goal areas, 5 ways of working. So each of our 44 agencies, we're talking here about local governments, so municipal governments, the Welsh ministers themselves, our health service, our auditor, and all the other bits of Welsh public state have to demonstrate they're acting in a way which is long-termist, preventative, values integration and collaboration and involvement in all the decision making, and they can be and have been taken to court if they don't do that in ways which are demonstrable. So a very powerful act potentially, and supported by other legislation. For example, our Environment Act. We have a newish Active Travel Act, which requires councils to put in place active travel infrastructure and so on. And this should give a context for at least the possibility of a deep transformation towards sustainability. If you look at greenhouse gases, these are ways of greenhouse gases, territorial greenhouse gases largely, almost exclusively. You can see that we have seen falls in greenhouse gases since 2015 when the Act was inaugurated. But the problem is, if you look more closely at that graph, and if you look at progress, in the last few years, this is almost wholly down to the decarbonisation of the UK electricity grid, which Wales plays a part in through our renewables, but not a major part. I mean, a lot of this is coming from North Sea sited offshore wind and large already existing and newly built Scottish renewables. So it's interesting that the big progress that Wales has made in decarbonisation, at least, has come in an area which is largely non-devolved, so is managed by the government in London and using processes largely held over from the former Labour government. A minister called Ed Miliband was instrumental in building this in the Labour government in the 2000s when he started the process of decarbonising the UK grid through the strike price mechanism. So it's somewhat worrying that in devolved areas such as transport, agriculture, industry, and public sector itself, we've made almost no progress. And in fact, you can see the public sector has increased its emissions between 2017 and 2018. It'd be interesting to see how those numbers look during the pandemic, of course. Who knows where the numbers will go and what they will mean. But if we can't decarbonise housing with control of housing, why not? If we've got this really powerful act and we've got planning policy, which is which needs to respond to this. And the question I've been asking myself, increasingly, in the blog I link here and on Twitter and in my papers is how solid is future progress and what's really stopping our region from jumping to being something which is genuinely transformed into what we might think of as a sustainable region from a properly kind of holistic and conceptual viewpoint. There are a number of issues I identify very briefly in this talk. The first one relates to this lack of local control. So I've talked already about the fact that major economic levers are not in the control of Welsh government. We can't control interest rates, we can't control employment. It's very difficult, for example, for Wales to move to a universal basic income because we don't have control of work, pensions, the welfare state, which would then punish people who didn't go to work and weren't looking for work because they had a UBI that the Welsh government gave them, because the UK government wouldn't be on board with that. Same is true in Scotland, of course, to some extent. So on the public side, we don't have the tools that we might need to change behaviours around how we think about work. But in the private sector as well, we are a resource periphery, and resource peripheries don't have a lot of economic capital in kind of softer sense as well as in financial sense. So this picture is one I've taken from BBC News of the integrated steel works, Port Talbot. It's been there since about 1950. And it emits, in a good year for Tata Steel, it emits 7 million tonnes of carbon per annum. Now, Wales's territorial emissions are only 40 million tonnes per annum. So you can see that if we are thinking about a sustainable Wales, it does not include this steel mill, which currently employs around 1,200 people. And there is no way in which a government at Wales level can manage a transition to a sustainable economy without some of the levers around, whether it's carbon prices, which used to be EU level, now moving to UK level, one assumes, who knows, whether it's big industrial subsidies for research and development, although steel is pretty much as green as it's going to get, I think, and certainly carbon steel. So how do you engage with a company which is headquartered in India, or maybe one which is headquartered as Airbus? We have a plant making aircraft wings in North Wales, which is headquartered in Toulouse, the Airbus plant. How does the regional government move with the private sector to something which is a bit more sustainable? How do we manage this transition towards a greener economy, a genuinely circular economy, when the people who matter aren't in the room? They're not even in the country. That's a really big issue, I think. You get the issue then that in the argument about how we manage this process, people who don't want to impose extra costs on business will say, well, steel companies will just make their steel elsewhere in the world, and Wales will lose their jobs and emissions won't go down in aggregate. That may be true. I suspect it's not true for industries which are in chronic oversupply like steel, but that's a difficult conversation to have when you only have a very small amount of the jigsaw that you can piece together at the regional level. Even within areas where local control is clear, however, though, the second problem we have is that there's a real lack of political buy-in at Welsh Government level, holistically, across the goals of the Future Generations Act and for sustainable development more generally. For example, in the area of investment grant support for companies who might come to Wales, this in front of you is, I would pretend that this is my own car, but it's not. I don't have an Aston Martin DBX outside the house. But this Aston Martin DBX, I think they start at 100 and something thousand pounds, and they emit about 290 grams of carbon per kilometre. And Aston Martin were given an undisclosed sum by the Welsh Government to bring the production of this car to South Wales on an old airfield site. And this was in 2016, after the Future Generations Act was law. And somehow this happened despite the Future Generations Act. And in that little box there, you see an Ineos Grenadier, which is an old Land Rover. I suspect I'd need several more noughts to add to find the carbon emissions of that per passenger kilometre, because it's deadly old tech. And the Welsh Government tried to get Ineos to build that in South Wales, and they failed, and it's gone off to be built somewhere else, more cheaply, bless you. If you have actions like this on the part of the Welsh Government, clearly something's gone wrong. Somebody's not getting the message that, it's not even these are existing companies that we have to kind of manage down in terms of emissions. These are brand new companies setting up new investments, which are very high carbon. Aston Martin did promise they were going to make an electric DBX at the plant, but that promise lasted, I think, 18 months before it became clear that that plant was only ever going to make fossil fuel cars. Frustratingly, that plant is also now on the verge of closure after only 5 years. 4 or 5 years. In fact, it's been operating for about 2.5 years, I think, and it's about to close, it looks like, because of global market conditions following the pandemic. A third issue that I've called saving sacred cows. It's not just about external capital. It's not just about keeping the markets happy. What we have here is a region which has, as I've said, been focused on agriculture for at least 500 or 600 years, possibly longer than that. And, leaving aside global value chains, it's the value that's produced, the very limited value actually financially of agriculture, which is a real sticking point in thinking about our land use management and how we transition that to a more climate friendly and ecologically diverse kind of way of managing our landscapes. About 80% of rural Wales is upland pastureland, farmed by economically marginal, climate problematic and ecologically limited sheep farms, smattering of large dairy farms and poultry on lower ground. Horticulture is almost non-existent. There is not a stake. There are very, very small stakeholder groups looking to push horticulture in Wales. I regularly, in fact, last time I spoke at a farming festival in late 2018, a Welsh farmer on the same panel as me in front of an audience used the F word on me, and all I said was destocking. A measure of destocking of red meat animals will be necessary, and farmers really don't like that. There's big cultural kind of barriers to having those conversations, and farms are culturally very important because they were the ones who protected the Welsh language in all those periods in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries when the English were trying to kill the Welsh language in the courts, in official life. Welsh farmers carried on speaking Welsh, so they're very culturally important. And it's very difficult to get farmers to think about biofuels, carbon sequestration, renewables, tourism and recreation as their primary income stream, when obviously generations on generations, in some cases, have been running those farms. And those farms are very small, they have no financial capital, diversification is genuinely very difficult. So who will have difficult conversations about nitrates or CO2 per kilo of lamb? They're emerging, but very, very slowly, certainly post-Brexit, of course, when those farmers are becoming increasingly economically unviable anyway. I think the last point in terms of these barriers is what I've called conceptual and political straitjackets. And there's something overarching going on here. There's an overarching framing of sustainability, which relates to a lack of intellectual curiosity, political capacity, and electoral courage within Wales. Hopefully someone else will get that. As I say, intellectual curiosity, political capacity, and electoral courage in Wales, and no doubt in other places, it's probably the same in many of your own regions and nations. It's clear that a truly sustainable region will look very, very different to any that exists in the West now. And the nature of the required transformations maybe aren't clear, but there's a raft of ideas that point in the direction we know we need to go. We know it's about decarbonising transport, heating, the economy. We know it's probably about a good measure of relocalisation. But the pandemic, what's happened in the Suez Canal in the last month, is showing us about how vulnerable some of these supply chains are at global level, and you can't help but think that relocalisation is part of this picture. The obsessive focus on work as a way of creating income has been revealed as problematic by the in-work poverty that we've seen in the UK emerge over the last 10 years. So the de-emphasis of paid work in the face of not only that fragmentation, but also the increasing importance of automation and the incursion of digital technologies into the workplace means that we need to think about universal basic income, universal basic services as a way of somehow protecting well-being and welfare in a very changed world. And a proper circular economy, of course, as part of that, solid and really influential carbon taxes. None of this has really been encouraged at regional level so far, despite the Future Generations Act arguably, being a force which should have fronted those sorts of debates, because none of them are vote winners. None of those things are things which are likely to get you. We've got an election a week today across the UK and Scotland and Wales, very important regional elections. And, the sorts of transformations we're talking about are not the things that are uppermost in people's minds now, for very good reason, but 2 years ago, 4 years ago, and arguably a few years into the future, depending on what the direct impacts of climate change will be. Instead, parties have worked within existing systems, try to tweak them, try to incrementally change the way those systems work, to drive down emissions, haven't been very good at that, to drive up some of the support systems for our ecosystems, haven't really been very successful at that, because the entire system, is at fault. And unless you think about décroissance, it's much more elegant in French than it is in English. We call it degrowth, but the idea of, moving away from a growth-oriented economy to something more steady state, those sorts of discussions are simply not happening in the mainstream yet in Wales. This has been a fairly kind of negative presentation, I guess. But I think, there are some indications of progress made quicken. As I said, we are a week away from an election in Wales for our regional government, which might end up with a new coalition between our centre-left parties of Plaid Cymru, which are the independence-oriented party, and Labour, which is an offshoot of UK Labour, but still more environmentally kind of aware and oriented than the right parties in Wales and the UK. So if there's a coalition between those two parties, it might be the environmental issues are one area where they find common cause, and we might see some quicker progress on that. Maybe even we'll see the first ever Green MS member of the Senedd in Wales. We've not had a Green member of the Senedd in the last 20 years of devolution. It's no coincidence, I think, that most of our progress on environmental issues, the Future Generations Act, our plastic bag tax, happened in our last coalition government 10 years ago. Maybe that there's a pressure that happens in coalitions which makes the dominant party move more quickly on some issues. I hope to see that again. And in the face of these pressures on automation, climate, and the ecology, we are seeing some challenge to the dominant kind of neoliberal and agglomerative and work-obsessed model of regional development. If you went down I live on the side of the valley in South Wales, Cyber Valley. If you go down to the bottom of that valley, that town, Pontypridd, was 4 feet underwater. The main street of Pontypridd was 4 feet underwater in February 2020, following two very big, obviously climate-enhanced storms. So, I would hope that as these events become ever more regular, we've got at least a roadmap emerging and the power to take forward some of these actions, certainly to a great extent than I expect to see in England. In conclusion, the Future Generations Act is an important and novel tool to improve processes, outcomes of the public and third sectors in Wales in terms of environmental and social impacts, and hopefully the private sector as well. But what it can't do is force a transition to entirely different ways of doing business that the science tells us are required to save us from climate and ecological disaster. The issue here is a sustainability, environmental, and I'd argue socioeconomic, requires a complete disconnection from the global capitalist system. About 12 or 13 years ago, I pitched some of my thoughts to the then leader of Plaid Cymru, the Independence Party, and she said to me, so you were telling me, Calvin, I have to tell people in the Rhondda they can't have iPhones. And I said, well, yeah, if you're talking about developing a regional economy which is economically peripheral in a sustainable way, the first thing you have to do is stop £1,000 per person leaving, every year when they buy a new iPhone. Or they give money to Netflix, or all these other processes involved in global capitalism, which take not only money, but autonomy and agency out of, I would argue, in the last paper I've got, hopefully forthcoming, take autonomy, agency and money not only out of peripheral regions now, but all regions. All this control, all this money is heading for the west coast of America via the platforms and not coming back. And the investment model that requires an ever-expanding material base and financial base to provide a return on investment for idle capital is inherently unsustainable, I would argue. And to refashion a region which moves away from this and finds a way forward which is genuinely more responsible and sustainable, I think requires a lot more than active government. So thanks very much for listening. Hopefully it was of some interest to you, and I'm happy to take any questions that anybody might have.
Thank you so much, Calvin. Really interesting presentation. I was not aware that there is a Wellbeing Act in Wales, although I'm aware that the Wellbeing Alliance, for instance, is very active in Wales, as it is in Scotland.
That's true, yes. We have to be talking to those guys quite regularly. I know Duncan, who's running the effort in Wales, and it's a very good effort too.
Yeah. So I think Arno had a couple of questions. So he was wondering, what is the most relevant scale in Wales to improve well-being or sustainability, whether it would be at the city, village, metropole, territorial area level, and also whether these different entities at those scales develop integrated tools to improve sustainability?
Very, very, very good questions. So I've argued for a number of years now that a level which we currently in the UK call city region, which you might think of as a large rural county. So for Wales, 3 million people, we could divide Wales into 4 or 5 city regions or subdivisions. And each one of those subdivisions would be reasonably homogeneous, and they would represent sort of functional economic areas with commuting reasonably self-contained. And I would argue that that is the appropriate level to develop bespoke sets of policies which respond to the requirements of that region. So I've always argued that you can't use the same tools to push sustainability or indeed economic development in Pembrokeshire, which is a very rural, very tourism-oriented county, as in Wrexham, which is northeast of England, northeast of Wales, and links to the northwest of England in terms of its industrial structure. So it's a satellite to the northwest of England manufacturing region. You need bespoke tools at that level, I think. And I've argued for a number of years, completely uselessly, that the government in Wales should devolve policy implementation and development to that spatial scale. But what I also argue is that at Wales level, you then have the need to draw legal red lines with things like the Future Generations Act to ensure that that sub-level, those policies are genuinely sustainable, auditable, inclusive and respectful of diversity and socially fair. So the Welsh Government would effectively stop doing things and would remain a kind of regulatory framework with the Future Generations Act and the Environment Act to make sure that things were done properly. And then each of those 4 or 5 regions would then find its own path towards sustainability and to a genuinely, if you like, crowdsourced and local way to respond at that kind of base of like 500,000 to 750,000 people. In terms of your argument about your question about integrated tools, I mean, as Ed said in his introduction, I've tried to develop a number of tools for sustainability at Wales level, and the problem is they simply don't get used. I spent a lot of time about 7 or 8 years ago measuring the carbon footprint of tourism in Wales and to Wales, and putting some options on the table to reduce that carbon emissions by shifting to more local markets, for example. Who knew there's a global pandemic which would make this look like genius in 5 years' time? I was a genius back then, I just didn't know it. And to relocalize tourism. But of course, that piece of work never got beyond our civil service to even the ministers to look at, because the civil service thought, well, this is just obviously never going to happen. It's a bit too radical. We just kind of put that to one side. It's been very difficult to get that kind of the model that would require ministers to take action on their tables.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for the answers. And it's really sad to hear that there is little political buy-in, not only for an act that was voted in the parliament, but also for tools to measure this. And building on that, I was wondering whether those 7 goals that you mentioned for the Wellbeing Act, do they have specific targets, and are there indicators on measuring those? And if so, how ambitious they are, and who's tracking those?
Yes. So there's a set of 43 national wellbeing indicators which are linked to the Act, and our national statistician is required to report on those every year. The problem with them, and this is something I've written a little bit about, is there is very little debate about the causal links between policies and how those indicators change. So there's very little in the way of explicit conceptual kind of framing about how you do X and indicator Y changes. So, for example, we have an indicator on biodiversity, but it's not clear how far government actions. I mean, given that biodiversity is a global issue, and if the salmon don't come back to Welsh rivers because their climate change is affecting them in the sea, in the Atlantic, nothing we do in Wales will increase the number of salmon spawning in our rivers, because it's a global ecosystem, not a local one. So what these indicators don't have is, firstly, that underpinning conceptual solidity, and secondly, any debate about how far they interact with each other or are prioritized. So there's 43 indicators. Nobody says which you do first. Nobody says which is the most important. And nobody worries about if you increase the indicator on quality jobs, what that does for emissions, because the two things I know are inversely related. So they exist, they're there, they are published, they're notionally used, but the government has not so far built an auditable process around linking policy strategy towards those indicators and then tracking them.
Yeah, actually, I think it's a very good point of those conflicting indicators, isn't it? And then this could be solved by really applying those integrated tools to measure sustainability that could really capture trade-offs between reaching those targets. Mike Danson had a question, and he said, are there lessons from how communities in Wales dealt with COVID for a just transition? For example, reduced demand for fashion, non-essentials, and for buying local?
Yes, that's a very, very good question. I think what we've seen is, I think COVID is like an elastic, and it's stretched the elastic, and either the elastic will snap and we'll shoot off to a more sustainable path, or the elastic will drag us back beyond where we were in the first place. So I'm currently pitching to my university a emissions cap for individual staff members, or to my business school, an emissions cap on travel for individuals, active members of staff. And in management meetings, somebody said, well, that's great, but of course there's a huge pent up demand for travel, so let's do this next year. So there's that issue about how far we'll snap back. And there's an additional one, I think we've seen two behaviours. Firstly, a more local aspect where people like me have been maybe going down and shopping locally and walking home with shopping rather than dropping in on the way home from work, or shopping in Cardiff, which is my major city. And then an alternate where people are using Amazon much more. And those two things are obviously in tension. And I don't know how far one will win over the other. I think what's interesting is our Welsh government has stepped ahead of the UK government and said, and I think the Scottish government, I'm not sure, and said it wants to see 30% of working become home working for the foreseeable future. So after seeing what's happening in COVID, it now has an aspiration, not a target, but an aspiration that 30% of people should continue to work from home. Now, I argue that might be 30% less work, 30% fewer work trips. Sorry, Mike. Fewer work trips rather than 30% of people working at home. That's a bit too crude, I think. But the government certainly is trying to grasp the opportunity to think about how we even in a city as small as Cardiff, which is 60,000 people, there are agglomerative costs. There's some really bad buildings going up there. There's some real hour and a half queues to get into town in a car. So there are serious benefits to be grasped from this, and the government is at least starting to try, I think.
Yeah, and I think building on this and building on Mike's question about COVID. So I was wondering, you at some point you mentioned the saving cows and sheep as one of the obstacles in achieving this Wellbeing Act. And from what I know, please correct me if I'm wrong, there's a lot of extensive farming that goes on in Wales in terms of sheep and cows. And I was wondering whether the benefits from ecosystem services that this farming systems provide balance their climate impact, including rural livelihoods, for instance, sustaining those rural livelihoods. And to connect it to the COVID question, whether diversification and ensuring this just transition from maybe farming that is not that climate friendly to some other form of activity in the rural areas. And of course, the COVID pandemic is, and the those recovery plans that are coming up are a great opportunity for that. So whether don't you think this will be a better way to kind of shift activity in the rural area towards a more climate friendly approach?
Yeah, so I couldn't agree more. And certainly on the point of farming being a really valuable activity in a number of ways, that's certainly true. So, I think it's fair to say that whilst the Common Agricultural Policy has a number of demerits in its implementation in the last, well, certainly 30 or 40 years that I've been aware of it, it has helped keep Welsh rural towns alive, because the money flowing through the single farm payments and out through farmers into those towns has been vital. And you can see when we had our foot and mouth issue in 2000, 2001, I think it was. You know, when farming shuts down, everything shuts down in many towns. It's certainly true that Welsh farming is better than intensively farmed red meat. If you know, all those sheep and most of our cows live outdoors much of the year. It's not intensive in the same way as you would find South American farming, for example, and in other places. And there's lots to be celebrated about that. The problem is that, of course, red meat is like so up here in terms of emissions that even being at the low end of that distribution in red meat, you're still well above, you know, other produce. So there's an issue there. You know, it is clearly the case that both Brexit and COVID provide opportunities to refashion land management in Wales to deliver a wider range of outcomes in a more sustainable and economically viable way. I mean, you know, we are, because after Brexit, what happened in the UK is elements of farming support that used to be managed by the European Commission, and those regulations and incentives managed at Brussels level effectively, instead of coming back to Cardiff to be managed, because they were implemented in Wales, even though developed by Brussels, they were captured by the UK government on the way post-Brexit. So now the UK government controls the incentives for farmers in Wales. And the UK government is very keen that regions do not have an unfair advantage in something called the Internal Markets Bill, to make sure the UK's internal market remains integrated. And so what my worry is that the Welsh government might want to do things which reward farmers for environmental sustainability, for social actions, for stewardship more generally. But that incentive might firstly not have any money, because the money is staying in London, insofar as, you know, so we used to spend £300 million per annum on rural development and farm support in Wales, and that's not clear as that will continue to be spent. So the money won't be available to incentivise farmers. The farmers will look to London and Cardiff divergently for their kind of, you know, their framing, so they won't know. They need a much more complex landscape now, I think. And also the UK government will say, well, you can't possibly give farmers money to grow biofuels, because that's not happening in Yorkshire. That destroys the internal market, so you're not allowed to do it. So I think it's a really complicated, despite the fact I think lots of farmers want to do things better, they want to diversify, they understand that their way of farming is probably going away. It's a very complex institutional kind of landscape to navigate towards a better way of doing business. Okay, so I guess, yeah, there is a lot of a conflict of interest there from regional to Westminster level. Arno had another question, and I think this really connects to some of the comments you made during your presentation about degrowth and about people not really being receptive to, for instance, reducing red meat. So he was saying, you mentioned responsibility, prosperity, resilience, but nothing about sobriety. So the way people look at their own individual consumption. So is this linking to a lack of that sobriety awareness? Yeah, I think it is. It's not really surprising, because the Act is primarily aimed at organisations and institutions and trying to get them to change their behaviours. I think we've got a very good commissioner. Her name is Sophie Howe, and she is very keen to link the Act to people's lives. So, for example, I'm doing a piece of work at the moment. I've done work with her on the future of education in Wales, and I talk about the fact that rather than training planners and geographers, we need to train climate cutters and placemakers, and we've got the tools to do that. So there are narratives emerging on a different way of structuring, in that case, education in Wales, which is much more about understanding place-based approaches, understanding, as Arno says, a different way of doing business and a different way of living. So I think she's trying to go as far as the Act will allow to have conversations with people. But in the absence of willing actors to reinforce that, who have day-to-day kind of connection with people, it's very difficult. So, you know, I'm working with my local town council on their climate emergency plan, and you would hope that the municipal level would start to have these conversations about travel and about consumption. But we're quite a way away from actually any hard decisions and hard conversations being had, I think.
Well, you know, looking at this well, I would define it as a bit of a lack of commitment and the political buy-in that you were mentioning in your presentation. I think this goes back to a question I should have asked in the first place, and that's why was this Wellbeing Act adopted in the first place?
So it was almost an accident. We had a very active Minister for the Environment back in 2007, 2011, I think she was in place. And she started the plastic bag tax, and she started us down the path of what would become an overarching act to govern the public sector. And she was, allowed, indulged by her party to take that forward. I think in part because some of the ideas were clearly self-evidently really good, like a plastic bag tax. And we've seen some, I mean, genuinely, she had a real focus on domestic waste as well. And Wales remains, 10 years later, one of the top European regions for domestic waste recycling. So some of that stuff really did stick. Her name was Jane Davidson. She did a load of really good work to push that forward. And that when she left, other ministers, some of them now unfortunately departed, this mortal plane as well as government, took that on, and its momentum carried it through Parliament in a way which survived 3 administrations really from the start to the end. And it was the thing which just kind of somebody had to pick up and deal with. And the environment said, okay, we'll take it forward to the next stage. And it almost by default ended up as law. NGOs in Wales, our local versions of the WWF, Friends of the Earth and others, academics like myself, other interested parties pushed to make sure it didn't get forgotten. And I think a happy set of circumstances put something in place which is potentially very useful, but as I think Mike says in the chat, the implementation then becomes a real key. The Commission's office has a budget of, I think, about 3 million euros a year, which is nothing, which is, it's just 3 million a year to change Wales. So we've still got a really big implementation gap, but I think it's a set of happy circumstances at the end. And the Act is also a mess. If you read it, it's a real mess, and implementing it's very difficult. But yeah, that's where we are, I think.
Okay. Are there any other questions from the audience? No? Well,
one in the chat.
Asked.
Manuel, yes, hopefully. I'm delighted. There are very few things that the UK government does which delight me, but the fact they've signed up to Horizon 2020 as a full partner is extremely good news. And certainly, I'm on research leave next year, and I hope to. I'm doing a number of things next year around this agenda, ranging from working with the local community in the valleys called Treherbert, which is taking some control over its local land back from the Welsh Government. My own university, I'm working with colleagues in the Basque Country, and at all levels, I think that if we could marry the aspirations of the Future Generations Act in Wales with the ability to implement different policies of places like the Basque Country and other regions in Europe which have genuinely found a different way to deal with capitalism, then I think there's real strength there. And knitting that together is something I'd be very interested in.
Yeah, and I think it will, from what I hear, it will take a lot of participatory approaches with the communities, and really having them to kind of co-own whatever comes out of it in terms of transition.
Yeah. I mean, before we finish, the initiative I'm involved in, which is in a very poor part of Wales, we'll develop a joint management plan for about 1,000 hectares of woodland, which is conifer plantation. It's not woodland. It's very poor quality plantation. But that does provide an opportunity for people in the local area. What they want local jobs. They want wood supply chains. They want to be able to walk in the woods safely and happily and improve their well-being, particularly post-COVID. And it's projects like that. And that's a town of 3,000 people, with 1,000 hectares around them. And if they could change that area, that's a hugely powerful story then, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, on that positive note, thank you so much, Calvin, for a really, really insightful presentation and an even better discussion. And we're so happy that you took the time to be here today for the webinar.
It's a pleasure. Thanks very much for the invite. I know it's not quite circular economy, but I really enjoyed giving the presentation. So see you soon, I hope.
Absolutely. Arno?
Yeah, thanks, Calvin, for this presentation. I just want to remind everyone that we have our next webinar. It's May 27. We welcome to Patrick Oliva, who is coming from to Paris Process on Mobility and Climate. He's going to speak about mobility and climate change and circular economy. And so you can find all the information on the website of ERASME. And if you want to join the email list to invite you for the webinars, just send me an email. I can put you on the list. And so you will know about the news and the programs for all the years. Okay, thanks. Thanks everyone to be connected for this hour. We're very happy to see you and maybe see you next month.
Absolutely. Have a nice day. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.